The American Southwest desert holds secrets deeper than buried bones. It swallows highways whole, bleeds towns dry, and sometimes it leaves behind monuments to forgotten journeys. Places like the Last Stop Diner, a skeletal husk shimmering under an unforgiving sun, miles from anywhere that matters anymore. For Leo, a travel photographer running on fumes and fading hopes, it was supposed to be just shelter from the blistering heat after his car gave up the ghost. But some places don't just shelter you, they absorb you. Inside the dust-choked silence, the empty booths weren't empty at all. They pulsed with unseen sorrows, unheard arguments, and the crushing weight of countless last resorts, waiting to add another story to their spectral menu. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The heat pressed in on Leo's battered sedan like a physical weight. Outside, the Arizona landscape was a brutal masterpiece of ochre, rust, and bleached bone white under a vast, indifferent sky. The air conditioner had surrendered hours ago, leaving him stewing in a cocktail of stale air, sweat, and the metallic tang of anxiety. His fuel gauge needle hovered precariously over the E, a stark red accusation mirroring the state of his bank account. "Look, Sarah, I told you, the deposit didn't clear yet," Leo muttered into his phone, the signal crackling like dying embers. "No, I don't know why. Maybe the gallery owner is sunning himself in the Bahamas with my money. Yeah, funny. Rent's due, I get it. Just give me another day or two." The line went dead before he could finish, swallowed by the immense, signal-devouring emptiness. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat with a sigh that tasted like dust. Another failed pitch, another bridge potentially burned. At 31, his dream of capturing the soul of forgotten America felt less like a calling and more like a sentence. He was running, all right, running out of cash, out of options, out of road. That's when the engine sputtered. A cough, a violent shudder, then a wheezing silence that was somehow louder than the engine's roar. Leo coasted to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires like broken teeth. He turned the key. Nothing. Again, just a pathetic click. "No, no, no," he whispered, banging his fist lightly on the steering wheel. He popped the hood, though he knew less about engines than he did about ancient Sumerian pottery. A brief inspection confirmed his ignorance. Everything looked engine-y. Nothing obviously broken, smoking, or detached, just dead. He leaned against the hot metal, scanning the horizon. Nothing but shimmering heat waves distorting the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching in both directions. Miles from the last pitiful excuse for a town, miles from the next. The sun beat down mercilessly, each ray a tiny hammer against his skull. Panic began to bubble beneath the surface of his cynicism. Dehydration wouldn't take wrong out here. Squinting against the glare, he saw it. A shape disrupting the flat horizon, maybe 5 or 6 miles down the road. It wavered, indistinct, like a thumbprint smudge on the sky. A building, a trick of the heat. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through his resignation. He grabbed his camera bag, instinct, habit, maybe the only valuable thing he had left, and the near-empty water bottle, locked the useless car, and started walking. The asphalt radiated heat, turning the air into a convection oven. Sweat plastered his shirt to his back within minutes. His throat felt like sandpaper. The distant shape solidified slowly, agonizingly with each step. It resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of a roadside diner. Faded glory, American dream gone to seed. A tall signpost, rusted and listing, still bore some faded letters, L.A. Last, Steep Din R.
The last stop diner. Apt. As he drew closer, the initial flicker of hope guttered. This place hadn't seen customers in decades. The paint was peeling in long strips, windows were grimy or boarded up, and tumbleweeds huddled against the foundation like skeletal patrons. The once gleaming chrome trim was pitted and dull. A neon sign depicting a steaming coffee cup hung precariously, its tubes cracked and dark. It looked less like a refuge and more like a sun-bleached carcass. Still, it was shade, and maybe, just maybe, a landline, a forgotten cache of bottled water. He pushed through a screen door hanging off one hinge and tried the main entrance. The handle turned with surprising ease, the lock long since rusted into submission or simply broken. The air inside was thick, heavy, and blessedly cooler, though only marginally. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the filthy windows. The smell was a complex blend of decay, stale grease, old cigarette smoke, and something else. A faint, almost floral sweetness, like cheap, faded perfume. It was a time capsule sealed by neglect. Cracked red vinyl booths lined the walls, their surfaces split like old scars. Formica tabletops were dull beneath a layer of grime. Behind the long counter, chrome stools stood like silent sentinels, their padding ripped and spilling yellowed foam. Faded menus were still tucked behind the napkin dispensers, promising coffee for 50 cents and blue plate specials lost to time. Leo scanned the counter, the back rooms visible through a swinging door. No sign of water. His hope dwindled further. Exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled towards the nearest booth, the vinyl sighing under his weight as he collapsed on the seat. The silence was profound, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the faint buzz of unseen insects. He closed his eyes. The cool, relatively, darkness, a welcome relief. Just a few minutes rest, he told himself. Just catch his breath before figuring out the next impossible step. He didn't know it yet, but he hadn't found shelter. He had found the heart of the silence, and it was listening.
Leo drifted in that hazy space between exhaustion and unconsciousness, the desert heat still radiating from his skin, despite the shade. The silence of the diner wasn't peaceful. It felt pressed, layered, like holding your breath underwater. Then, faintly, beneath the hum in his own ears, he heard it. Clink. The distinct sound of a fork tapping against a ceramic plate. He opened his eyes, scanning the empty booth across from him. Dust motes swirled, nothing more. Probably just the building settling, he reasoned, or the wind whistling through a crack somewhere. He was tired, dehydrated. Auditory hallucinations weren't unheard of. He shifted, trying to get more comfortable on the cracked vinyl, resting his head against the high back of the booth. He closed his eyes again. Don't know how much longer I can do this, Martha. He doesn't listen. The voice was a low murmur, barely audible, seeming to emanate from the very air around him, specifically within the confines of the booth. It was a man's voice, weary and saturated with a quiet desperation. It wasn't directed at him, but felt like an overheard fragment of a long-finished conversation. Leo sat bolt upright, heart suddenly pounding. He looked around the diner. Empty, silent. The voice was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Okay, Leo, you're losing it, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Heat stroke, that had to be it. He needed to find water, or this would get much worse. Still, an unease prickled the back of his neck. The sound had felt localized, tied to this specific spot. He slid out of the booth, his boots crunching softly on unseen debris. Maybe a different booth would feel less weird. He chose one further down, near a boarded-up window. The vinyl here was a different shade of faded red, ripped in a different pattern. He sat down, deliberately listening. For a minute, nothing but the oppressive silence. Then, a different sound. A sharp intake of breath, tight and angry, followed by a low guttural whisper,
consonants biting through the quiet. "Swore you wouldn't. Lied right to my face. Gonna pay." This voice was harsher, laced with simmering resentment and the promise of violence. It faded, replaced by the distinct thump of what sounded exactly like a fist hitting a tabletop, rattling phantom silverware. Leo flinched, instinctively drawing back. This wasn't fatigue. Each booth seemed to possess its own distinct auditory ghost, a specific emotional frequency trapped in the decaying material. He stood up again, his earlier exhaustion warring with a growing sense of dread. This place wasn't just abandoned, it felt occupied, not by people, but by echoes, fragments of intense moments caught in a loop. His gaze swept across the diner, pausing in a booth directly opposite him, bathed in a particularly bright shaft of sunlight. As he watched, the air above the table seemed to waver, like the heat haze off the highway, but thicker, more localized. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, the shimmering air coalesced, taking on the vague, translucent outlines of two figures leaning towards each other, heads bowed, locked in what felt like a silent and intense argument. Their forms were indistinct, like watercolor bleeding on wet paper, devoid of detail but radiating palpable tension. Then, as quickly as it formed, the mirage dissolved back into swirling dust motes in sunlight. Leo blinked hard, rubbing his eyes. "Heat stroke," he said out loud, trying to convince himself. Definitely heat stroke. But the image was seared into his mind. The hunched shoulders, the proximity, the sheer weight of unspoken conflict he'd felt radiating from the empty space. He backed away from the booths, retreating towards the relative neutrality of the counter. The stools felt less loaded, but the air still hummed with something unseen. He looked back at the rows of booths, each one a small, self-contained theater of past dramas, the one where he'd heard the sad confession, the one vibrating with residual anger, the one where he'd seen the argument. What other stories were trapped here? What other phantom sounds lingered just below the threshold of hearing? He thought of his camera, the photographer's instinct: document, capture, understand. But what was there to photograph? Empty seats? Dusty tables? How do you capture a sound that isn't there? A feeling that doesn't belong to you? A mirage born of decades-old despair? He forced himself to take a few deep breaths, trying to quell the panic. He was stranded, possibly hallucinating, in a derelict diner that felt increasingly like a repository of human misery. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the dusty windows in hues of orange and deepening the shadows within. Night was coming to the last stop diner, and the thought filled him with a profound and unfamiliar dread. The whispers on the vinyl felt like only the beginning.
As the desert outside cooled under a tapestry of emerging stars, the atmosphere inside the last stop diner shifted. The oppressive heat lessened, but the peculiar phenomena intensified, growing bolder in the deepening twilight. The faint whispers and fleeting sounds didn't just continue, they became entwined with something far more invasive. Leo, driven by a morbid curiosity that outweighed his fear, found himself drawn back to the booths. He chose one near the center, its vinyl relatively intact, and sat down cautiously. He hadn't heard anything specific from this one yet. For a moment, there was only the familiar dusty silence. Then it washed over him, not a sound, but a feeling. It started as a hollow ache in his chest, a profound sense of weariness that went bone deep. Then it swelled, expanding into a wave of crippling, suffocating loneliness. It felt vast, oceanic, the kind of isolation that settles in when you realize you are utterly adrift in the world. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, unbidden. A sob hitched in his throat. The emotion was overwhelming, intensely personal, yet utterly alien. "This isn't mine," he thought, struggling against the tide of sorrow. "This isn't my feeling." He gripped the edge of the formica table, knuckles white, anchoring himself against the psychic undertow. After a long moment, the wave receded, leaving him shaken and emotionally raw, the echo of profound sadness lingering in the air like a phantom chill. He scrambled out of the booth, breathing heavily. He moved to another one, the booth where he'd heard the angry whispers earlier. Hesitantly, he sat. Almost immediately, a different current surged through him. A hot, prickling irritation started in his gut, coiling upwards. It morphed into a simmering resentment, then flared into outright rage. His jaw clenched, his fist tightened unconsciously. He felt an almost uncontrollable urge to lash out, to break something, to shout into the echoing silence. Images flashed behind his eyes. Betrayal, injustice, a burning sense of being wronged. Again, the feeling was intensely powerful, visceral, but its texture was wrong. It lacked his personal history, his specific triggers. It was pure distilled anger, preserved like a specimen in a jar. He forced himself to stand, pushing back against the borrowed fury, feeling drained and slightly sick. It wasn't just sounds and emotions anymore. The haunting was becoming multisensory. Near the booth, imbued with loneliness, a faint cloying scent hung in the air. Stale coffee grounds mingled with the cheap, powdery sweetness of a long-evaporated perfume. He hadn't smelled it so distinctly before. Near the angry booth, the air felt colder, a localized drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the cooling desert night. He ran a hand over the tabletop, and the formica felt unnaturally icy beneath his fingers. Leaning against the counter, trying to clear his head, he glanced at the dusty chrome trim that ran along its edge. For a split second, reflected in the dull metal, he saw movement beside him, a fleeting impression of someone sitting on the stool next to his own, a hunched shoulder, a dark shape, vanishing the instant he tried to focus on it. He spun around. Nothing, just empty stools and deepening shadows. Fear was now a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. But beneath it, the photographer's instinct, the observer's curse was stirring insistently. This was extraordinary, terrifying, yes, but also unlike anything he'd ever encountered. He had to document it. He unzipped his camera bag, pulling out his DSLR. He started taking pictures, systematically capturing each booth, the counter, the dusty kitchen pass-through. He shot in the low light, letting the shadows pool, hoping the lens might capture something his eyes missed. Later, scrolling through the images on the small screen, his heart sunk. They showed exactly what he saw, a decaying, empty diner. Dust, decay, loneliness captured only in the composition, not in any spectral anomaly. The eerie presence was completely absent from the images. He switched to his phone, using its audio recorder app. He placed it on the table of the sad booth and sat opposite, waiting. He didn't hear the murmured conversation again, but the feeling of loneliness began to creep back. He forced himself to endure it for several minutes, then stopped the recording. He moved to the angry booth, repeated the process, feeling the rage begin to simmer again. He did the same at the counter, near where he thought he'd seen the reflection. Later, huddled on a counter stool, he plugged in his earbuds and listened back. Beneath the expected ambient noise, the faint whistle of wind outside, the creaks of the old building, his own breathing, there was something else. Faint, distorted fragments of voices buried deep in the static. On the recording from the sad booth, a sound like a choked sob, clearer than anything he'd heard live. From the angry booth, a sharp, distorted word that might have been liar or why, cutting through the hiss. From the counter, a confusing jumble of overlapping murmurs, too faint to decipher. Electronic voice impressions, EVP. The kind of thing he'd always dismissed as wishful thinking or pareidolia. But here, now, coupled with the intense emotional and sensory experiences, it felt chillingly real. He wasn't dealing with ghosts in the traditional sense, no rattling chains or transparent figures demanding justice. This was something else, something more insidious, emotional static. The air itself seemed saturated with the residue of intense human experience, trapped in a repeating loop. And the longer he stayed, the more attuned he became to its frequencies. He felt a compulsive need to understand what this place was, how it held on to these feelings. Fear mixed with a desperate curiosity. He was trapped here until dawn at least, and the diner, it seemed, had plenty of stories left to tell. Resigned to spending the night, Leo knew he couldn't just sit and passively absorb the emotional onslaught. If he was going to survive this experience mentally intact, he needed answers, or at least context. Understanding the source of the echoes might provide some defense against their power. He decided to explore the diner more thoroughly, moving beyond the main seating area. Behind the counter, the floor was littered with debris. Old order slips, broken sugar dispensers, fossilized napkins. He carefully stepped over the mess, pushing through the swinging doors into the kitchen. It was worse back here. Grime coated every surface. Stainless steel counters were streaked with rust and decades of neglect. Ancient cooking equipment stood silent and imposing, like idols of a forgotten religion of grease and frying. He checked the taps, dry as the desert outside. No water here. His attention was caught by a small, cluttered office tucked into a corner, barely more than a closet. A dilapidated metal desk dominated the space, its surface buried under ledgers, invoices, and yellowed papers. A calendar pinned to the wall was frozen on July 1978. Most of the paperwork was mundane: supply orders, tax forms, faded handwritten notes about shift changes. But tucked beneath a heavy, dust-coated ledger, he found something more intriguing. It was a small stack of water-damaged menus, their covers depicting a cheerful, stylized waitress offering a steaming pie. The prices listed inside were laughably low: coffee 50 cents, cheeseburger $1.25, the highwayman special, steak, eggs, hash browns, coffee for $3.95. They offered a glimpse into the diner's heyday, a time when this lonely stretch of road pulsed with life, with travelers stopping for fuel, food, and a moment's respite. Beneath the menus lay a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. The masthead was from a local county paper dated October 1981. The headline, partially obscured by a water stain, read, "Local man vanishes near highway stop." The article detailed the disappearance of a traveling salesman named Arthur Penhaligon, last seen having coffee at the last stop diner. His car was found abandoned a few miles down the road, similar to Leo's situation, but Penhaligon himself was never found. Police suspected foul play, but no leads ever materialized. The article mentioned the highway had a reputation: remote, dangerous, easy for someone to simply disappear. It didn't explicitly blame the diner, but its presence in the story cast a long shadow. Leo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the phantom cold spots. A man vanished after being here. How many others over the decades? Transients, runaways, people just passing through? This diner sat on a road that swallowed people. He continued digging through the desk drawers. He found a spiral-bound notebook that seemed to be a makeshift staff log. Most entries were mundane: low on ketchup, fixed jukebox, Mildred called in sick. But interspersed were stranger comments written in different hands over what seemed to be several years. Weird feeling in booth 4 again tonight. Customer complained felt watched. Dated 1975. Had to break up fight booth 7. Guy swore other fellow appeared out of nowhere. Dated 1979. Lady at the counter crying hysterically. Said phone call gave bad news. Left in hurry. Felt awful sad near payphone after she left. Dated 1980. Closing early. Power flickering. That buzzing sound won't stop. Place gives me creeps tonight. Undated. Possibly near the time it closed for good. Leo carried the logbook and the newspaper clipping back into the main diner area, the pieces clicking into place. He looked at the booths, now bathed in the eerie silver light of the moon filtering through the grimy windows. Booth 4, the one where a customer felt watched. Was that where he'd seen the shimmering figures? Booth 7, the site of the phantom fight, where he'd heard the angry whispers and felt the rage. The payphone, long ripped from the wall, but its ghost lingered near the counter, perhaps connected to the intense sadness he'd felt in the nearby booth.
The logbook mentioned a woman receiving bad news there. The salesman, Arthur Penhaligon, last seen having coffee. Which booth had he sat in? Had he been arguing with someone? Had he been desperate? It wasn't ghosts. Not in the traditional sense of sentient spirits interacting with the living. Leo began to formulate a theory, grounded in the unsettling experiences of the night. This place, the Last Stop Diner, acted as a kind of psychic battery, or perhaps a recording device. For decades, countless people had stopped here, often at moments of heightened emotion. Crossroads decisions, whispered confessions, arguments fueled by exhaustion and bad coffee, moments of intense grief, rage, desperation, even fleeting joy. This diner, especially the intimate, contained spaces of the booths, had soaked it all up. The isolation of the desert, the specific materials, the vinyl that held warmth and impressions, the chrome reflecting fleeting moments, the very dust settling like layers of memory. Maybe they somehow trapped and amplified these potent emotional residues. These weren't spirits haunting the place. They were emotional echoes, fragments of intense human experience imprinted onto the environment, stuck playing on a loop. The diner wasn't haunted. It was saturated. A crucible where the emotional static of the highway had accumulated over decades, never truly dissipating. Understanding the what didn't necessarily lessen the fear, but it shifted it. He wasn't being haunted by the dead, but by the lingering, raw feelings of the living, long since departed. The tragic, the angry, the desperate moments left behind by strangers, echoing endlessly in the silence. And realizing this led to a new, more disturbing thought. If the diner recorded intense emotions, what was it recording now? His fear? His desperation? His own encroaching despair?
The deeper the night grew, the more permeable the barrier between Leo and the diner's trapped emotions became. Understanding the mechanism didn't grant him immunity. If anything, it made him hyper-aware of the subtle, insidious ways the place was interacting with him. The echoes weren't just playing back anymore, they seemed to be resonating. He found himself inexplicably drawn back to the booth where he'd felt the crushing loneliness. As he sat there, the familiar wave washed over him, but this time it felt disturbingly shaded with his own recent anxieties. The phantom sorrows seemed to latch on to his own feelings of failure. The failed photography career, the strained relationship with Sarah, the sheer grinding solitude of his current predicament. The general despair of the echo sharpened, focusing on his specific disappointments. It felt less like an alien emotion and more like his own melancholy amplified, distorted through the diner's psychic lens. He quickly moved away, heading towards the angry booth. He hesitated before sitting, bracing himself. The expected surge of fury came, hot and immediate, but woven into it were threads of his anger, his frustration with the broken-down car, his resentment towards the gallery owner who hadn't paid, the simmering bitterness about his stalled life. The phantom voice he sometimes heard here seemed to twist, the unheard accusations subtly mirroring the arguments he'd had, the things left unsaid. It was terrifying. The diner wasn't just playing back old recordings, it was using his own emotional state as a tuning fork. The echoes were finding frequencies within him, latching on to his vulnerabilities, his cynicism, his regrets, his deep-seated loneliness he rarely acknowledged. The phantom conversations he occasionally overheard now seemed to incorporate words or themes startlingly relevant to his own inner turmoil. A whispered phrase about running out of time felt directed straight at him. A sigh heavy with financial worry resonated perfectly with the call to Sarah. Worse still was the physical bleed-through. He'd find himself sitting in the lonely booth, slumped forward, head in his hands, mirroring the posture of deepest despair, without consciously deciding to adopt it. In the angry booth, he caught himself clenching his jaw, his knuckles white on the tabletop, just like the phantom presence he imagined.
It wasn't just feeling the emotions, he was starting to physically embody them. Brief, jarring flashes of imagery, unconnected to his own memories, began intruding. Sitting in one booth, he saw a fleeting afterimage of a woman's hand nervously shredding a paper napkin. In another, the distinct mental picture of greasy truck stop coffee swirling in a thick mug. These weren't memories. They felt like sensory fragments from the echoes themselves, bleeding into his consciousness. Faces he didn't know, snippets of scenes unrelated to his life, flickered at the edges of his perception. He paced the dusty floor between the counter and the booths, feeling increasingly agitated. The lines were blurring. Was the despair he felt his own, amplified? Or was it the diner's, seeping into him? Was the cynicism coloring his thoughts, his natural disposition, or was it residue from countless disillusioned travelers? He felt like a sponge soaking up decades of negativity, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The true horror began to dawn on him, crystallizing from the emotional fog. The danger wasn't just being scared or driven mad by the phenomena. The danger was becoming one of them. If this place collected and amplified intense emotional imprints, what would happen if he succumbed completely to his own despair, his own fear, right here in this supercharged environment? Could his own emotional breakdown become permanently etched into the fabric of the last stop diner? Could his sorrow join the chorus in the lonely booth, his anger fuel the phantom fight in another? Could he become another whisper on vinyl, another fragment trapped in the loop, adding his own story to the diner's tragic collection? The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through him, colder and sharper than any of the borrowed emotions. He wasn't just fighting for his sanity anymore. He was fighting to avoid becoming a permanent resident, an eternal echo in this forgotten corner of the desert. He had to get out. But dawn was still hours away, and the diner seemed to be determined to know him, to absorb him, before it let him go. Seeking refuge from the overwhelming, specific emotional zones of the booths, Leo retreated to the long counter. He hoisted himself onto one of the chrome stools, the ripped vinyl sighing faintly beneath him. The feeling here was different, less targeted, less intensely focused than in the booths, but potent in its own way. Instead of a single dominant emotion, the air around the counter hummed with a low, indistinct buzz. It felt like the accumulated static of thousands upon thousands of fleeting interactions, orders placed, coffee poured, small talk exchanged, checks paid, goodbyes mumbled. It was the sound of transience, of movement, of brief connections made and immediately broken. Beneath this general murmur, however, lay a profound sense of observation. It wasn't malevolent, not actively watching, but it felt as though the counter itself, the nexus of the diner's activity, had passively witnessed everything, every transaction, every weary traveler, every whispered secret shared over lukewarm coffee. As Leo sat there, trying to ground himself in this less specific energy, a new manifestation began. The low buzz started to coalesce, not into distinct echoes of the booths, but into a confusing, overlapping wash of sound. It was like listening to a crowded room through a thick wall. Dozens of voices murmuring simultaneously, laughter blending with arguments, orders being called out by phantom waitresses, the clatter of unseen plates. No single conversation was clear, yet the impression of conversation was overwhelming. Then, within that sonic tapestry, certain threads began to stand out, chillingly familiar. Snippets, distorted but recognizable from his own recent past. Deposit didn't clear yet. Rent's due, I get it. Give me another day or two. Fragments of his desperate phone call with Sarah, the one right before his car died, surfaced within the murmur. They weren't just echoes of long-gone patrons anymore. The diner was incorporating him into its spectral symphony. It was learning him, analyzing the emotional data he'd brought inside. The argument,
laced with his financial anxiety and desperation, was potent enough to register, to be woven into the existing tapestry of human struggle. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread washing over him. This wasn't just a passive recording device. It felt almost aware. Not conscious in a human sense, perhaps, but possessing a kind of passive, absorbent awareness. A repository that didn't just store emotional energy, but actively collected and perhaps even cataloged it. The echoes weren't independent entities fighting for attention. They were facets of the diner's accumulated memory, reflections in a dusty, multifaceted mirror. And now, his reflection was being added to the collection. He looked down the length of the worn Formica counter, imagining the countless elbows that had rested there, the stories told, the decisions made, the journeys begun or ended. Each patron leaving behind a tiny fragment of themselves, an invisible emotional residue. The diner hoarded these fragments, composing a haunting, discordant symphony of the human condition. Loneliness, anger, hope, despair, fleeting connection. Sitting there, amidst the phantom murmur that now included his own anxieties, Leo felt profoundly exposed. The diner knew his failures, his fears. It had tasted his despair and found it resonated with the existing collection. The passive observation of the counter felt intensely personal now, as if the very structure of the place was assessing him, measuring his emotional weight, deciding where his echo would fit best, when, or if, he finally broke. The counter, once a perceived neutral ground, now felt like the diner's central processing unit. Analyzing the latest input, Leo, the struggling photographer, stranded and afraid. He slid off the stool, needing to move, needing to escape the feeling of being so thoroughly known by the empty building. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. The first hint of pre-dawn gray began to dilute the oppressive darkness outside. A sliver of hope, fragile but persistent, flickered in Leo's chest. He had survived the night. But leaving, he suspected, wouldn't be as simple as walking out the door. The diner's influence felt like a heavy cloak clinging to his shoulders. The echoes seemed more insistent now, pulling at him, whispering invitations back into the booths. His own fatigue and despair resonated powerfully with the ambient sorrow, creating a feedback loop that threatened to anchor him there. He couldn't just flee. He felt a strange, intuitive certainty that simply running wouldn't break the connection. The diner had tasted his fear, his desperation. It had started weaving him into its fabric. To leave cleanly, he realized with a jolt of clarity, he might have to consciously leave something else behind. Not succumb to the existing despair, but offer a different kind of imprint. Something intentional, something that signaled his departure, not his dissolution. It felt like a bizarre psychological transaction, a way to satisfy the diner's passive hunger or disrupt the resonance he'd fallen into. Taking a deep breath, Leo began a final walk through the diner. He moved deliberately, confronting each resonant space. He paused before the lonely booth. The familiar wave of sadness washed towards him. "I hear you," he whispered to the empty vinyl seats, his voice raspy. "I feel your sadness, but it's not mine to carry. It stays here." He focused, dredging up his own flickering hope for the future, the desire to get back on the road, the possibility of another photo, another chance. He tried to project that feeling, however small, into the space, a counter-frequency against the tide of despair. He moved to the angry booth. The simmering rage prickled at his skin. "Your fight is over," he stated, keeping his voice steady. "Your anger isn't my burden." He concentrated on the simple, powerful desire to leave, to walk out into the sunlight, channeling the feeling of forward momentum, of escape. He continued this process, booth by booth, acknowledging the trapped emotion but refusing to be drawn in, consciously asserting his own presence and his intention to depart. It felt like a strange, psychological transaction, a way to satisfy the diner's passive hunger or
disrupt the residence he'd fallen into. Taking a deep breath, Leo returned to the very first booth he had collapsed into upon arrival, the one where he'd first heard the phantom clinking, the desperate murmurs. This felt like the point of entry, and now it had to be the point of exit. He stood before it for a long moment. Then, acting on instinct, he raised his camera. He framed the empty booth in his viewfinder, the cracked vinyl, the dusty table, the way the weak dawn light illuminated the space. He focused sharply on the emptiness, on the absence. He didn't take the picture to document the haunting this time. He took it as a deliberate act of separation, of framing his departure. As the shutter clicked, capturing the image of the vacant seat, he consciously poured his remaining resolve into the moment, the decision to walk away, to reclaim his own story. Simultaneously, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, insignificant, a scratched lens cap he kept forgetting to replace. He placed it deliberately in the center of the dusty table, not as an offering to appease some entity, but as a marker. Leo was here. Leo left. A different kind of imprint, not of despair, but of defiance. As his fingers lifted from the lens cap, a final powerful wave washed over him. Not one specific emotion, but a chaotic surge of all of them combined. Loneliness, anger, fleeting joy, fear, desperation, hope. A dizzying, disorienting psychic chord struck by the diner itself. It slammed into him, threatening to pull him under one last time. He braced himself, planting his feet, focusing on the image of the open door and the brightening sky beyond. Then, release. The intense pressure vanished. The oppressive atmosphere didn't disappear entirely, but it lessened significantly, like a radio station fading into static. The clinging feeling receded. The air felt lighter, cleaner. He had checked out. Without looking back at the booth or the lens cap, Leo turned and walked towards the front door, the promise of daylight pulling him forward.
Leo pushed through the creaking front door and stepped out into the harsh, cleansing light of the desert dawn. The air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stagnant, emotionally charged atmosphere inside the diner. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Looking back felt like an invitation for the place to reclaim a piece of him. He turned onto the empty highway and started walking, putting the skeletal silhouette of the last stop diner behind him. His legs felt heavy, his body wrung out, but his mind felt surprisingly clear, scoured clean by the intensity of the night. He focused on the horizon, on the rhythm of his own footsteps on the asphalt, on the simple act of moving forward. The diner shrank in the distance, eventually becoming just another indistinct shape shimmering in the rapidly warming air. He was free, changed, undoubtedly, but free. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down with familiar intensity. His throat was parched, his lips cracked. Just as true exhaustion began to set in, threatening to overwhelm his resolve, he heard the rumble of an engine approaching from behind. A county sheriff's patrol car pulled up alongside him, dust billowing from its tires. The window rolled down, revealing a weathered man in his late 50s, sunglasses masking his eyes. Sheriff Miller, according to the name tag. "Morning," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly. "Bit early for a stroll, isn't it? Car trouble?" Leo nodded, too weary to elaborate. "Broke down back there. Sheltering in that old diner." The sheriff's expression didn't change much, but Leo caught a flicker of something. Maybe recognition, maybe just professional assessment of a potentially dehydrated transient. "The last stop? Yeah, that place," he trailed off, then seemed to shake his head slightly. "Got a bad reputation, attracts vagrants. Some folks say it's haunted, but mostly it's just decay and bad memories. Lucky you didn't run into any trouble of the two-legged kind. Hop in, I'll give you a ride to Cedar Gulch, nearest town with a garage." Leo gratefully accepted, collapsing into the passenger seat. He didn't offer any more details about his night in the diner. He knew the sheriff wouldn't believe the full story, might even think he was delirious from the heat. Explaining emotional echoes and psychic imprints felt impossible in the rational light of day, under the skeptical gaze of the law. He just mumbled his thanks and stared out the window as the desert blurred past. Cedar Gulch, civilization, a mechanic, maybe even a non-haunted cup of coffee. Months later, Leo was back on the road. He'd managed to get his car fixed, scraped together enough cash to keep going. He was still a struggling photographer, still chasing the soul of forgotten America. But something had shifted within him. The cynicism remained, perhaps even deepened, but it was tempered by a strange new sensitivity. He found himself increasingly drawn to empty spaces, vacant chairs and bus stations, abandoned farmhouses silhouetted against the sky, quiet corners and otherwise bustling diners. He photographed them obsessively, trying to capture not just the emptiness, but the feeling that lingered within it, the weight of absence. One rainy afternoon, in a different state, hundreds of miles from the Arizona desert, he was reviewing his recent digital photos in a cheap motel room. He paused on a shot he'd taken earlier that day, an ordinary, functioning roadside diner, focusing on an empty booth by the window, rain streaking the glass outside. It was a mundane image, technically sound but unremarkable. But as he zoomed in, examining the play of light on the vinyl seat, his blood ran cold. There, caught in a trick of light, almost imperceptible, was a faint shimmer, a subtle distortion in the air, vaguely outlining the hunched form of a solitary figure leaning over the table as if lost in thought or despair. It looked unnervingly similar to the heat haze apparitions he'd glimpsed in The Last Stop. His finger hovered over the delete button. Was it a reflection, a lens flare, or had a fragment of the diner's phenomenon clung to him, changing how he perceived the world, or worse, following him? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He pressed delete. The image vanished from the screen. But the memory remained, the feeling of echoes clinging to forgotten places, the weight of stories unspoken, the knowledge of what can haunt the empty booths when the last customer has long since driven away into the dust.